Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to our Rome-Med dialogue with United Nations High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet. Welcome, High Commissioner, and thanks for being with us today. This is our last important dialogue before the 7th edition of Rome-Med dialogue, co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Rome, 2 to 4th of December in a hybrid format in Rome. We will host over 30 events, bringing together high-level officials as well as leaders of governmental, international organizations, business, and civil society to discuss, as we do every year, and share analysis on the region's future. Today we are honored and privileged to be hosting High Commissioner Bachelet for the second time after the previous positive dialogue during the recent T20 summit, and we will focus on human rights challenges in the MENA regions. Two brilliant colleagues and friends are with me in moderating today's session. Dr. Tuqa Nusairat, Deputy Director of the Rafik Hariri Center and the Middle East Program at the Atlantic Council. Thanks, Tuqa. And Dr. Federica Saini Fasanotti, Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Senior Associate at ISPI. Thank you, Federica. Twice President of Chile, High Commissioner Bachelet has been engaged with many international organizations for more than 30 years. In 2011, she was the first director of the UN Women, and she has recently pledged to be a gender champion, committing to advance gender equality in the international fora. High Commissioner, in our last conversation at the T20 event, you highlighted how pre-existing inequalities had been aggravated by the pandemic and have highly affected vulnerable groups such as women, refugees, and poor community. Today our focus, as mentioned, is on the MENA region, where we find the same situations and problems. In your opinion, what are the key priorities to address in the region?
Well, I think that based on the realities on the ground, I would like to highlight some issues that require attention as a matter of priority. A common thread in the MENA region, as witnessed, for example, by demonstrations in Algeria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iran, and Iraq, is people taking to the street to demand their governments to provide them with clean water, electricity, employment, and quality education. Across the region, there is a dire need for greater attention to the protection and realization of these economic and social rights, which is the primary responsibility of the state. Their absence in many instances, also due to corruption and mismanagement, has led to the dire situation in which increasing segments of the population in the region find themselves. I would say also that doing more to address the impact of corruption and mismanagement on the protection and realization of human rights in the region is urgently needed. Transparency, for example, about critical economic issues is key to driving growth and enhancing trust in governments. Removing impediments to the freedom of expression and peaceful association, including in the context of anti-corruption protests, are crucial for accountability as well. Good governance and human rights go hand in hand. When economic and fiscal policies ignore the rights of the population, especially of those who are marginalized, human rights and stability are both at risk. Across the MENA region, health systems have collapsed in many countries, and there is a crisis of vaccine inequity, which is creating setbacks to development, but also to human rights intrinsic to development. So I believe that a crucial lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that embedding human rights in all decision-making processes should be a key priority, and if I may say, a precondition to build inclusive, stable, and sustainable societies. And my office will continue working to maximize the force of our partnership across the UN system and beyond to ensure that human rights and sustainability are at the heart of efforts to respond to and to recover from the pandemic. But we must also pay particular attention to vulnerable groups and those in situations of vulnerability, as you rightly noted. The MENA region holds the largest numbers of conflict-induced refugees in the world. And in the face of growing environmental threats, the situation is likely to worsen unless immediate and effective measures are taken. Many countries in the world have an influential role to play in the MENA region. The international community as well must assess the impact of its actions on the people of the region, and I would say to act to ensure that their rights are respected and protected. And to act effectively, we must all work together. All actors must support participatory and representative decision-making, transparent and accountable institutions, the rule of law and administration of justice, and of course, the empowerment of civil society.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I would like now to move into a specific dossier, specific countries, with the help of Tuqa and Federica. Let me now turn to Tuqa first.
Thank you, Paolo and ISPI, for this opportunity, and Ms. Bachelet for the opportunity to discuss some of these important human rights issues in the Middle East. So let me start with one of the most pressing concerns that I believe you are looking at and focusing on is Syria. So 10 years after the Syrian uprising, what do you expect the human rights situation to look like as the US and other countries are leaving Syria? President Assad is being rehabilitated and the international community is kind of accepting that. He will remain in his position. What picture can we expect for Syrians inside of Syria? And do you have any hope that there will be any genuine improvement in the human rights of Syrians?
Well, I think in Syria today, we see a situation in which the realization of many human rights, from the right to life, to a right to adequate housing and the right to health, particularly important in the midst of the current global pandemic, are impossible to realize for many Syrians, as you rightly said. My office closely monitors the situation of human rights throughout the country, and we are concerned about the ongoing violence, which has increased in recent months, but that continues to impact civilians. The economic crisis further threatens, I would say, the realization of rights, especially of the most vulnerable. More and more Syrians struggle to meet their basic needs, increasing prices, loss of income and employment, including due to COVID-19 and currency devaluation, have all contributed to this significant deterioration. There is no doubt that the picture is bleak, but I believe that we must always have hope that things can and will improve. I think that's a central part of our work at OHCHR, finding avenues for hope and pushing for change. We cannot do something different. The way forward must place the voice of Syrians at the center of all these efforts. We must be guided by the knowledge and the needs of the Syrian people in our work. I think if the international community also adopts this people-centric approach, we can truly move forward in this extremely difficult context. I mean, for me, it's really difficult what we see and the kind of lack of progress that we see. In discussions on the future of Syria, we must also always, I would say, take into account the question of refugees and those who have been displaced. And the returns of millions of people to their homes, both refugees or IDPs, must be made, I would say, voluntary and in a safe, dignified condition. Extremely important is an essential step in moving towards a sustainable peace in Syria are effective accountability, justice and remedies for the violation and crimes committed by all parties to the conflict. I will take this opportunity to refer to the issue because this is a very important issue for myself of missing persons, which touches the lives of so many Syrians today and will impact the ability, I would say, of families to realize their rights to the peace process and future stability of the country. And this is for me personally, because in my country, Chile, we had that experience. And I know, as I'm a doctor, I always say, a wound to heal needs to be clean. If there's something that's not clear, you need truth, you need justice, you need accountability. So while enforced disappearances and arbitrary detentions were already a serious concern in Syria prior to 2011. The phenomenon of missing person has been greatly exacerbated by the conflict. And families from all parts of the countries are struggling to know the fate and whereabouts of their relatives and find ways to deal with pressing needs. So given OHCHR's lack of access, it is difficult to estimate the number of those missing. It is suggested that for the cases related to detention alone, there are at least tens of thousands of forcibly disappeared persons held by the government of Syria, including in unofficial detention facilities, and hundreds who have gone missing at the hands of the non-state armed groups. So the overwhelming majority of these individuals are men, so their situation has a continuing impact on their families, because particularly women who face, can face practical, financial, and emotional hardship as they strive to support and raise children of their own, while simultaneously trying to find the relatives where they are, who are missing. So one crucial element that could support the Syrians and respond to a request that has been made by many is the creation, and I truly am calling for that, of the creation of international mechanisms, as has been done in some other places in the history, to clarify the fate and whereabouts of the missing persons in Syria and provide support to their families. And I believe there is an opportunity to make progress on this issue, to work with all parties in a way that is mutually beneficial. I think that finding these avenues for change and progress will be critical in Syria going forward and in so many other conflict situations.
Thank you, High Commissioner. If you agree, I would now move to Libya with Federica Saini Fasanotti. Federica, you have the floor.
Hello, High Commissioner Bachelet. Thank you for being here. And yes, I would like to ask you something about Libya and the difficult situation that we have on the ground right now. So it's been now a decade after the death of Gaddafi, and but Libya still struggles in upholding an efficient system of governance and of course human rights. So what kind of support of action you think that the United Nations could provide or take to improve the situation right now?
Well, I think that in Libya, including UNSMIL Human Rights Service, excuse me, can you see me because it went black? Well, okay, I hope you see me because I don't see you anymore. In the UN in Libya, including UNSMIL's Human Rights Service, is currently undertaking numerous activities to support the strengthening of governance structures. Much has been done, but the UN must continue to identify, I would say, strategies to further support Libyan democracy, the rule of law, and human rights protection. Core among such efforts is ending impunity for human rights violations and building foundations for civic space in which civil society and human rights defenders can operate safely. Let me mention some examples of work that the UN is doing in Libya. With regard to women's rights, the UN is supporting efforts to update the current legislation on violence against women, aiming to bring national laws fully into compliance with Libya's human rights obligations. UNSMIL Human Rights Service has been facilitating consultations to develop this new legislation and was able to help build consensus around critical issues related to the protection of women and girls, for example, from violence. Going forward, the UN will facilitate and support Libyan stakeholders as they launch an advocacy campaign in support of the draft law. On arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance continue to be a primary challenge to the protection of human rights of Libyans. Many individuals are held without charges or without the possibility to challenge the legality of their detention. In addition to thousands held in official prisons, armed groups are detaining thousands more in conditions amounting to enforced disappearance. For those put on trial, serious concerns persist with regard to violation of fair trial rights. UNSMIL's Human Rights Service, at the request of Libyan judicial authorities, is continuing its long-standing support to the judiciary to strengthen its capacities to uphold national and international law, including in relation to the prevention of torture, due process, and fair trial rights. Most recently, Libyan judicial authorities have requested the Human Rights Service in Libya to provide training for 200 of its prosecutors. The training will help build crucial knowledge, I think, of best practices, including with regard to international standards for criminal justice and fair trial. The UN also continues to advocate for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained or subjected to enforced disappearance. Libya has yet again seen an increase in attacks on human rights defenders, journalists, activists, and individuals engaging in public political discussion, and such attacks take the forms of assassination, abduction, unlawful detention, and enforced disappearance, with some individuals being convicted for security-related offenses based on the exercise of their right to freedom of expression. Others, often women, who participate in public life are subjected to online hate speech and campaigns spreading false information. Human Rights Service is closely monitoring the situation and remains in dialogue with the Libyan authorities to ensure the protection of all who participate in public life and contribute to upholding civic space and fostering inclusive dialogue on democracy and human rights. It is also working with Libyan civil society organizations to enhance their legal protection by promoting legislation that will ensure that civil society organizations are able to work independently and without undue interference from the state. Extremely worrying us also is the situation of migrants and asylum seekers, as also highlighted in our public report. Many of them are subjected to human rights violations and abuses as smuggler, but also by Libyan state agents such as government detention center officials or the Libyan Coast Guard. So while supporting Libyan authorities to improve the situation of migrants, our Human Rights Service of UNSMIL there and the UN country team are working to ensure the full implementation of the UN Secretary General's Human Rights Due Diligence policy on United Nations support to non-United Nations security forces, all with a view to preventing and mitigating identified risks of grave violation of international humanitarian law, human rights law, or refugee law by the Libyan security forces that are receiving United Nations support. But one of the things that I would want to add, if I may, is that I believe that we are in a very complicated situation in looking at the elections, at the next elections. And I hope that all parties will really include the West and the East will include each other so we can get into elections that are fair, that are transparent, and that everybody can feel that they are represented. And I feel that Libya is still very polarized, and everything that the international community can do to bring them together will be really important.
Thank you. I would like now to move to another crisis, which is Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, okay.
The last extraordinary G20 summit has offered the international community some necessary step to address a huge potential, and potential maybe it's optimistic, humanitarian crisis. What further steps are needed? In other words, what are the most pressing challenges you see regarding the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think that humanitarian economic crisis in Afghanistan threatens the basic needs of millions of Afghans. Let me just stop here by saying I saw today in the CNN a news about how parents are selling their daughters, and we're talking about 4-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old daughters, because they have no food, or because they lend them money and then they have to sell it to a 70-year-old man. So for me, the situation, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is terrible, and it will become worse because of the drought, because of the winter, because of the lack of agricultural capacities. So we are estimating now the UN is feeding about 4 million Afghans, but we feel that this need will increase even to 22 million next year. So I think Really, this is a terrible concern. So the rights of the most vulnerable are an increasing cause for concern as more Afghans really struggle to meet their basic needs. So displacement, poverty, limited access to cash, acute food shortage, drought, increasing prices, loss of income and loss of employment, including due to COVID-19, have continued to this, I would say, continue contributing to even deteriorate even much more the situation. The data is extremely worrying. Over 500,000 people have been internally displaced alone in 2021. Most of them are women and children. Unfortunately, the number of people forced to flee continues to rise. The health system in the country is on the brink of collapse. Millions of people in Afghanistan have lost access to basic health services. Medical supplies and fuel are running out across Afghanistan. 9 out of 37 COVID-19 hospitals have already closed, and all testing and vaccinations rates have dropped. The country is at risk of a more intense pandemic wave amid critical gaps in the health system, medical supplies, personnel, and equipment. So any economic downturn will negatively affect a large spectrum of economic and social rights of all Afghans, in turn increasing protection concern, particularly in relation to protection from exploitation and abuse, and as I said, forced child marriage, and so on. As economic strife prolongs, individuals and families may resort to drastic measures, trafficking, child labor, sale of children for survival if they are unable to access humanitarian aid. The struggles of human suffering of millions of Afghans, especially those living in open spaces or camps, will be exacerbated by the harsh winter, which is on our doorstep. So millions of Afghans, including children, will face starvation unless urgent action is taken. The withdrawal of large-scale development systems, lack of access to cash, and reduced overseas remittances is really worrying. Limited supplies of cash are also making it difficult for humanitarian organizations to pay salaries on time, procure critical humanitarian supplies, and provide rapid assistance. As for the Taliban, it's very difficult right now to be able to pay the salaries of the health workers, the teachers. So there is a need for the international community to support Afghanistan economy and to demand that full, unimpeded access to humanitarian aid for all Afghans, including women and girls, be guaranteed and respected. The participation of women humanitarian and frontline workers in aid delivery is crucial. I mean, the majority are women, the ones who do the work there. The international community needs to continue to decentralize humanitarian assistance, ensure that it distributes those who need, and promote, I would say, the security and protection of civic space in the country. So we need to find new ways to reinvigorate the provision of social protection services, help to ensure the delivery of at least, I would say, essential basic levels of economic, social, and cultural rights, mitigating the negative impacts of unemployment and creating access to education. So above all, we must sustain the interest and solidarity of the international community beyond this current crisis. Many countries did a commendable job in evacuating human rights and women's rights defenders in urgent need of protection. We need to support the neighboring countries sheltering Afghan refugees. But beyond that, we need to look for strategies that can rebuild and empower the Afghan civil society. Some of this will need to happen outside the country, helping activists and journalists find their feet and develop their work remotely. But ultimately, we need to find ways to reach and sustain civil society within Afghanistan that can begin to bring real change. I know that all of this is very complicated because on the one hand, of course, the international community do not want to recognize the Taliban as a government, but we need to save lives and livelihoods. I mean, we have to think how we do it in a way that the poorest, the most vulnerable are the ones who are not responsible for what's going on will not suffer even more. It's not an easy solution, but I think we need to find a solution.
A terribly gloomy scenario, and we will stick to Afghanistan a little bit more, moving now to women and human rights defenders in the region, and I will turn to Federica. Federica.
Yeah. So yeah, it's my question is very connected to your introduction, High Commissioner. We know that the United States and NATO forces at this point have completely left Afghanistan, and now we have the Taliban, and we know that the Taliban let's say that do not see women in a very good way. What do you think that, given the situation right now, where women are in Afghanistan are above all protected by private NGOs and things like that, but not a super institution like the United Nations? What do you think that United Nations could do for the human rights and above all for women of all ages? I mean, children and teenagers and women. So given the fact, but I know that a big difficulty in this moment is the fact that the Taliban is not a unified entity. I mean, they are often absolutely disconnected, one unit from the other, also in Kabul, for example. So I know that this is a very difficult question and a strategic one, probably. But I would like to know from you, how can the United Nations operate in this moment in Afghanistan and in the future in a practical way,
Well, as you know, of course, a lot was done to empower women in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. They assume public roles, leadership positions in the media, across the society, for example, in education, judiciary, even in the police. And now the lives of women and girls have changed, of course. Women have been progressively excluded from the public sphere. In many areas, they are prohibited from appearing in public spaces without a male guardian. In many professional sectors, they face increasing restriction. But I have to say something, that you just mentioned something that's really critical, and that is that, as you say, there's not an even position. You see places where not only the basic education of girls is going on, but also in some places, teenage female education. I mean, very few, but there are some. And in some places, women health workers can work, in some others cannot, and so on. So we know that furthermore, girls over the age of 12 have been prevented from attending school. They have said that they want to protect the girls, and that we should give them time to show that they really intend girls to go to school and to continue developing. But until now, we have not seen any, if I would say, real progress on that. One of the things is that there's very little international community right now in Afghanistan, only a bunch of embassies and the UN. I mean, we are trying to do our best together with other UN actors to find ways to preserve at least some of the human rights gains of the last 20 years, including the capacity and agency of women and girls in the Afghan civil society that has emerged over the past 2 decades. So going forward, the international community, including the UN, must be firm in demanding the need to ensure that women emancipation and equal rights are maintained at all times and throughout the country. And one of the things that we have said that for us is sort of a very important sign, if there's any real intention of this, is that beyond the primary level girls' education, we need to see that the real interest in girls to continue education throughout the teenage life and in the university, and also pathway for women to continue careers should be the highest priority. We will continue listening to women, girls, amplifying their voices, supporting them, reminding the de facto authorities to uphold women and girls' human rights. And the international community is trying to push to the extent possible towards a peaceful and pluralistic society that respects human rights for all. As Taliban, I think there is an opportunity though. I mean, first of all, I think countries who have been important in the relationship with the Taliban in the past should leverage that relation and should try to insist on the needs to respect human rights for all, but in particular also women and girls that we know are in a bigger threat. But as on the other hand, and there's also an opportunity because Taliban are looking for international recognition, but also that their frozen assets will be defrozen. So I think there is an opportunity to sort of tell them you want this, you need to show that you really mean it. You need to make the possibility of girls go to school and go to the university a reality. You need women that work to be able to continue working. So I think we are and I think today I was listening in this CNN information And this was the Taliban spokesperson that was speaking about the terrible their conditions of people who are having to sell girls, and they did not agree on that. So I'm not sure it will work, to be honest, but I think it has to be said clearly. Look, if you want some things that I know they need, because they need to pay salaries to the people, to the public functionaries, to the health workers, to the teachers, and we want the teachers to be there, we want the girls to be able to go to school and receive education, and we want people, if they're sick, to be able to receive that support. Because one of the things that breaks my heart is what the DSG of UNAMA was telling me, that mothers are bringing the children to the hospital because not because they're sick, it's because they haven't eaten for a week. So the situation is really terrible. So it's very difficult, if I would say, balance on how, on one hand, we know that there is a dire humanitarian situation. We cannot let people die. But on the other hand, they have to understand, the Taliban, that they need to do something more than announcement. And that those announcements need to be serious, because when the UN, the international community and the UN said to them, look, you need to show certain things, and one of the things is an inclusive government. And the second, and you have to include minorities, ethnic or religious minorities, women, etc. And the second was women and girls. I mean, the three minimum rights of human rights, and the third was that humanitarians have access to everyone. Okay, they announced that they will include in the government a Tajik and Uzbek, but they were Taliban. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about real diversity. So the Secretary General has made it clear that the UN will engage with the Taliban to promote the human rights of Afghans, with particular attention to the rights of women and girls. And I think the international community, including all member states and regional intergovernmental institutions, should commit to strong advocacy of women and girls' rights as part of any engagement with the de facto authorities, whether relating to development, not to humanitarian. Humanitarian, we believe humanitarians have no color. We need to stop people from dying. So humanitarian does not have conditions. That's something that the UN in every part of the world don't put conditions on humanitarian. But yes, on development, yes, on narcotic control or any other topic. And I believe that the course of Afghanistan's future will be in part decided by the interest and solidarity of the international community, and we will continue to advocate with all concern, including the de facto authority. And I have to tell you what, my colleague there, she has gone with the DRST to have meetings with the Taliban and to tell them which are the treaty bodies, the international laws that they have signed in the past, I mean, Afghanistan, and they're committed to. So we're doing our job as well. I mean, not only talking about women's rights, but also human rights at all, because we think that we need to ensure that to continue advocating for the respect and protection of the fundamental rights for all Afghans, supporting the Afghan civil society as well as much as we can.
Before I turn to Tuqa again, High Commissioner on Afghanistan, you mentioned clearly the conditions we are asking the Taliban to get any financial assistance or any defrosing of the funding. These conditions have been around now for a few weeks. I mean, these were the ones we set, Europe and the United Nations and many countries set early September, with not many results, as you mentioned. How united is the international community? I'm not asking you to mention who is not, which country is not helping in the united front, but how united is the international community in pressing the Taliban on these issues?
Well, I mean, I think there are two different issues. One, I think the majority is pressing, even though countries who still are there. And because one of the things we also have said is that Islamic countries that has a practice that can show that women's rights can be compatible with Islam should show them, and there are a lot of neighbors who could share with them practices that could help them to balance what they believe in the Sharia and the possibility of human rights. So that is something we have asked member states to do as well. We have also asked powerful regional powers, regional powers to try to also leverage the relationship with them, to try to insist that they have to I would say, fulfill the promise, because they said they were gonna. When they, sent this letter to the pledge conference of money for Afghanistan, they sent a letter that was full of, they were respecting women's rights and humanitarians, etc., and human rights. So I think there is probably, what I have felt talking to different member states is that what they're not unified, and maybe someone does not know how to do it yet, first of all, because they used to give all the money to a government and they don't want to do that. And so how can they support it? A country whose GDP was like 70% supported by international community and suddenly has nothing? It's really a terrible situation. So some members are trying to identify how they can do it without breaking their principles. Some international financial institutions are looking at how in their boards and discuss, and they get certain ideas to how to solve this problem, as it has been done in some other countries in the past. And some others have a different thing. They are not sure which is the, I would say, most effective strategy. So, for example, when we discussed in the Human Rights Council, and I was calling for an independent investigative mechanism on human rights and women's rights, that was not the agreement at the end, because there was no agreement on that, but there was an agreement on special rapporteur on human rights that was and to make, of course, and we will continue in UNAMA doing our monitoring or reporting of human rights. So I think there is different perspective. On one hand, countries who are not sure that this kind of pressure will have the best result, and others who are not sure how to do it. But I think in general, some more convinced than others, of course, there is a sense that the Taliban don't want to be the pariah of the world, and that there is an opportunity to try to convince them that they need to have certain basic standards if they want either engagement with them or financial support.
Thank you very much. As mentioned, I will now turn to Tuqa. Tuqa, you have the floor.
Thank you. High Commissioner, as you are well aware, several UN offices and officials have condemned Israel's designation of 6 Palestinian human rights and civil society groups as terrorist organizations about 10 days ago. This opens us up to the broader question of the misuse of the terrorist designation by governments that are often attempting to suppress those who expose human rights violations. We know there are other examples of this beyond Israel in the Middle East as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what support your office will be offering to these groups and other organizations in Palestine that have been facing and will continue to face similar repressive measures by the Israeli authorities?
Well, as you probably know, Tuqa, last week I issued a press statement on Israel's designation of the 6 civil society organizations as terrorist organizations, calling this action an unjustified attack on Palestinian civil society, which should be immediately revoked. Because I have to say that organizations concerned are some of the most reputable human rights and humanitarian groups in the occupied Palestinian territory. And most disturbingly, the designation decisions under the Israel counterterrorism law of 2016 are based on extremely vague and unsubstantiated reasons, including, I would say, entirely peaceful and legitimate human rights activities, such as providing legal aid to Palestinian in detention or organizing activities for women in the West Bank. So my office will continue raising its voice on actions targeting civil society and will continue to engage and cooperate with these organizations, several of them being key partners in our work in occupied Palestinian territory. Israel's designation based on its 2016 counterterrorism law is just one example of human rights concerns in counterterrorism laws, as you mentioned, including using an overly broad definition of terrorism, problems of due process, and allowing evidence to be kept secret. As I have repeatedly underlined to member states, counterterrorism legislation must be in line with human rights standards and must not be applied to legitimate human rights and humanitarian work. The banning of organizations must not be used to suppress or deny the right to freedom of association, or to quash political dissent, or silence unpopular views, or limit the peaceful activities of civil society. The national authorities responsible for proscribing organizations must comply fully with the state's international human rights obligations, including by respecting the principles of legal certainty, proportionality, equality, and non-discrimination. And we'll do our best, but we do have our issues there as well.
Thank you.
As you may know, our international staff are all outside because we have not gotten the renewal of their visas.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We have been extremely disciplined, and so we still have a few minutes within the time agreed with the High Commissioner. So I ask Tuqa and Federica if they want to add another question, and I will have another last question as well for the High Commissioner. Let me start with Federica, if you have a question.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would like to ask you something about also Libya, which is my main subject of studies. And I would like to know, because we have talked many times about the prisons in Tripolitania, but I would like to know something more, if you know something about the prisons and human rights in Cyrenaica, and which is now under the control of the OHCHR and Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar. So, if you know something, I mean, I'm very curious about that.
Well, we launched a report with UNSMIL on the situation on prisons and detention, and of course but I don't have specific information of one versus the other, and of course we could visit mainly prisons where there were migrants or people, asylum seekers, but we did not, and we saw of course terrible violations of human rights. I mean, prisons, overcrowded prisons. We saw women that were, I mean, first of all, they were raped in prison, people in terrible condition on not having access to legal counseling, etc., etc. So we have a report on the whole situation, but not specifically on the ones you are asking. Sorry, Federica. But I will ask my colleagues, and if I find out, I will let you know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. So following up on my previous question about using the terrorist designation as a way to pretext to crack down on peaceful dissent, some of these policies, as we've discussed, still remain. But now in the recent year and a half since we've been experiencing this pandemic, we've seen some governments use the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to suppressing dissent and protests and even online discussions. So what do you think the impact of COVID-19 has been on human rights defenders in the region, and what role can your office play in pushing back against this trend?
Yeah, we have witnessed a significant shrinking of civic space globally in the wake of the pandemic. Some of them because of real restriction, I mean health restrictions that are okay. Some of them because it was used as an excuse to shrink the civic space. And of course, the MENA region is not an outlier in this respect. During lockdown periods, we saw restrictions of freedom of movement in many countries, with those in violations being subject to arrest and detention and excessive use of force, I would say, against protesters. So very worrying has also been the reaction of government to criticism and demands from civil society and human rights defenders, with protests and demonstrations being stifled, and arrest and detention of individuals reported in many countries. So to put this in context, it is important to note that these measures take place in countries with limited space for public involvement in decision-making processes, including in policies concerning public health. Many governments in the MENA region seem to have been taken advantage of the pandemic to step up state censorship and to control the dissemination of information, affecting not only journalists, but the population's access to information. And in several countries in the region, such as Iran, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, the authorities reportedly closed news websites allegedly for spreading fake news about the pandemic, or blocked individual social media accounts, including those of health professionals who disputed, for example, official figures or who criticized the government's response to the pandemic. Some countries even suspended the printing of newspapers on the ground that this will prevent the spread of the virus. In Iran, according to reports, the authorities arrested human rights lawyers and defenders who had planned to file a lawsuit against the authorities' management of the COVID-19 pandemic and charged them with national security crimes. So my office has repeatedly underlined that measures that have taken to control the pandemic must not be used to curtail individual rights. In this context, it's important to, I think, to emphasize the crucial role of social media companies in providing a digital civic space for the exercise of freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, often in the absence of other space online. And we see that in the MENA region. These companies often contribute to silencing voices, sometimes in conjunction with measures by the governments. So the international community, including home state of such companies, have a fundamental role to play in ensuring that these operate in ways that respect human rights.
High Commissioner, we move towards the conclusion, and I would like to have a final question, which may look a little bit personal, and I hope it is not too personal, meaning you have an extraordinary reputation for being a passionate leader, and we have witnessed this today as well. We had this great pleasure. A leader willing to make the difference in whatever role you are taking. And looking at your current role as High Commissioner, when you go to bed every night, what is your biggest concern of the many challenges we mentioned today? And if I may, what is your biggest frustrations in terms of inability to perform the role in addressing the crisis you would dream to perform?
Well, the first thing, maybe I would start with my frustration, is that, you know, human rights, the office, the High Commission of Human Rights, it's a very, very special mandate, because it's supposed to be the voice of the voiceless on one hand. And I have to say, at the end, that's the easiest part, because you can always raise your voice when you know what's going on. But on the other hand, you're supposed to engage member states, because it's the state's responsibility to protect, promote, and respect human rights. So, and we also, we in our mandate, we need to give them, we have to monitor, we have to report, but we also have to give them technical assistance, no? And many times, human rights violations are there because there are root causes which we are not the ones who can usually be operational about, you know, root causes linked to inequalities, to religion, to ethnic differences, or root causes of conflict many times because of climate change impact. For example, farmers and herders that fighting for the same land, or the lack of water. So, and becoming, this is very personal though, coming from a political background and being a doer, I mean, of course I think, but I also want to be a doer. This job is not for a doer, doer in terms of operationalizing things. Of course, I always try to do my best on human rights, but also to identify which are the challenges, which are the problems there, which are, who could be the ones who could be the entry points where we could make a difference. Maybe the head of a country is not the person, but maybe you have people surrounding, or maybe you can work through a mayor to try to ensure that human rights are respected. So it is very challenging, and I like that. I like challenges. I like to try to think not in a very, if I may say, sort of completely closed framework point of view. I try to think what is beyond there. What are the roots of this? I know that maybe in the classic human right, that's not typical, but in my case, I always try to understand that. I always try to find other actors there that could be very important. And I'm talking about any country, not only the MENA region, in Latin America, in Africa, or in Asia. I will always try to think, what else should we do? Can we call for dialogue? How can we solve this problem? Because if we don't solve the political problem that's behind, usually, we're not going to solve the human rights problem. That's one area. And the other area is, how can we convince countries, in particular, for example, the MENA region, that feels that human rights are not universal, and that that we have to respect their culture and so on, and tradition. And of course, we always respect culture and tradition, but there's some things that cannot be used as an excuse to not respect human rights. So I'm always trying to think which can be the narrative, which can be the way. And I think one way is to work with also with people who are Islamists and are very, and we have done it, for example, with religious leaders, with faith-based organizations, to work how we are able to confront hate speech, how we are able to confront xenophobia or racial discrimination and so on. So I'm always trying to think which are the best ways, not only the traditional ways, I mean, of course, the traditional ways, but also other ways that we can make a difference and we have impact. Because as I said, to speak out is very easy, but I want to have an impact on the things. And sometimes the world is not getting better. So the only thing that I always try to remind myself is what Archbishop Desmond Tutu always said, that he's a prisoner of hope, because that's what we cannot give up. We have to continue, trying and struggling to find the best way to ensure the promotion of respect for human rights.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Thanks to Tuqa and Federica. High Commissioner, you may still have, as you mentioned, some frustrations, but we know we are in the best possible hands, and so we wish you all the best for your role and for your organization. And thank you again for being with us today, and thank you for all the people who followed this very interesting, honest, and conversation.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye, Federica and Tuqa as well. Bye.